Hi, everybody. This is Daniel Karapkin speaking to you from the Web Yeshiva platform. WebYeshiva.org offers a wide variety of different shiurim and classes for any Ben or Bat Torah. And we are studying Moreh Nevukhim from Thornhill, Ontario, from the Bayet Beth Avram Yosef of Toronto. We are in section 2 of Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. We are in chapter 22. Up until now, the Rambam has been very polite to Aristotle and Aristotle's followers. He is quite reluctant to clash directly and directly say absolutely unequivocally that they are mistaken. But things have come to a head by the time we get to chapter 22, and it will become time for the Rambam to essentially say we need to part ways from Aristotle regarding his cosmology or his view of the heavenly realm. Everything that he said is quite speculative, and when it comes to looking at the totality of all of the arguments that could be made, either in Aristotle's favor or against his favor, he loses. Aristotle is going to lose, and the Rambam is going to say some very direct words about Aristotle's failure in correctly describing the heavens. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at just an outline of the first part of the chapter. And then, because the last part of the chapter, of chapter 22, beginning on page 319, is really so direct and straightforward, we're going to be reading that together inside the text. So let me bring up my screen. For those of you who would like to download this document, you can find it on the Web Yeshiva platform for the course description for today's course on chapter 22 of the second section, or you can find it in the Facebook community, Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim. So here I'm just going to share my screen. The Rambam starts off with using Aristotelian logic to dismantle Aristotle's theory of the heavens. So again, 4 Aristotelian propositions that are universally agreed upon will create problems for Aristotle's cosmology, or the way that he views the universe. Now, just to review, we've been talking about for the last several chapters how Aristotle viewed that the universe is eternal and that it emanates by necessity from what he called the first or prime cause, that God is the source of everything that exists, even though everything has existed eternally, and that God does not volitionally or by will or by purpose bring about things that exist, but rather it is essentially, he does so by his very nature, out of necessity, because of his perfection. These things must emanate as a product of this deity. There are 4 propositions that dismantle this idea. Proposition number 1, and this is just a direct quote from the Moreh Nevukhim: it is impossible that anything but a single simple thing will proceed from another simple thing. That is, from unity emanates unity, from multiplicity emanates multiplicity. So the idea being in Aristotle's cosmology is that the prime cause, the deity, emanates one intelligence, one entity of pure intellect. That intellect emanates an intellect directly below it, and that third intellect emanates a fourth intellect, and so forth and so on, which creates a series of concentric intellects. Each intellect possesses a celestial sphere. Each sphere is embedded with stars and other heavenly bodies until you get to the lowest sphere, the sphere of the moon, which in turn emanates and helps to produce all that exists in our world, the sublunary realm. The problem, of course, is going to become that if anything that is unitary produces only unitary things, where does multiplicity come from if everything emanates from a completely unitary being that is God? Proposition number 2, items are not produced randomly, but must rather always resemble their antecedents. And as a quote, similarly, form does not proceed from matter, nor matter from form. And we'll see why that is important momentarily. Proposition number 3, when an agent acts with volition and purpose, such that multiple ideas occupy the mind of the agent and not out of necessity, the agent can accomplish multiple acts, unlike the first two propositions where the agent is acting out of necessity. So this is already the beginning of perhaps an explanation of by the Aristotelians as how something which is completely unitary can produce something which is multitudinous. And that is when you are producing something by volition, by will, the mind that produces by will can possess or contain many different ideas. I can be thinking about making a chair or making a table or making a glass or anything else, or a piece of furniture, or producing anything else. So since there are multiple things that can occupy my unitary mind, I can therefore emanate multitudinous things. But realize that that's only if I'm not emanating by necessity, but rather by will. And that's a division and a distinction that we talked about in the last two chapters, chapters 20 and 21. Proposition number 4, a compound unit that is comprised of similar materials is more consolidated and cohesive than a whole composed of various substances that have combined together. So for example, a bone, which is a compound material because it's comprised of calcified matter and marrow and blood and perhaps other materials that make up this compound bone, is more cohesive and more consolidated than a foot, which is comprised of not only bone, but flesh, of veins, of muscle tissue, of blood and skin. This is too clear, says the Rambam, to require any additional discourse. It's quite obvious that you can have things that are compound items, but there's different kinds of compound items. Some compound items are much more cohesive and consolidated, and other compound items are much more disparate in their makeup. And when something is a product of something which is unitary, we would expect that even if it is going to be a compound item, substance, it will be conservative in its compounded nature. That's really what this proposition is suggesting. So we have 4 propositions. Number 1, that which is unitary begets unitary. Proposition number 2, even when we talk about unitary begetting unitary, they have to be of the same kind. Form begets form, matter begets matter, but form does not beget matter or vice versa. Proposition number 3, the first 2 propositions were dealing with things that emanate by necessity. When something emanates by will, it is possible for that which is unitary to emanate various different products based upon the various ideas that occupy that volitional intellectual will. And finally, proposition number 4, when items that are of a compound nature vary in how cohesive or consolidated they are. Now, based on these 4 propositions, here are 4 challenges that the Rambam presents to Aristotle's cosmology, or his view of the heavenly realm. If, as Aristotle, challenge number 1 is as follows: if, as Aristotle claims, everything emanates from the deity, from this first cause, by necessity, how can there be more than unity emanating from unity? That is obviously the first question, because you're now going contra proposition number 1. Where do compound structures of the cosmos come from? The most basic question that one would immediately have to ask, based on the idea that God produces by necessity or emanates by necessity. If so, we would expect everything that is emanated from God to be absolutely resemblant to God's perfection, which by nature is unitary. Challenge, and we've seen this challenge a number of times before. Challenge number 2, we may concede an answer to the first question. And we could answer the first question by suggesting as follows: the emanation from the deity are intellects. And since intellects can contain multiple ideas, the further these intellects are from the first cause, the more they diversify, as per proposition number 3, that when you're dealing with an intellect that emanates volitionally, since many ideas can be contained within one intellect, you can have diversification emanating from that which is unitary. But we are still left with the problem of how can intellects produce material things, namely the celestial spheres, which even though they are made up of a material which is far more ethereal and not as mattery as the material of our sublunary realm, but it is still made of what is called matter in Aristotelian philosophy. And the question therefore becomes that this is contra proposition number 2. To quote the text, what relation can there be between matter and that which, being separate, has no matter at all? Contra proposition number 2, that matter begets matter, but form cannot beget matter. So how did the spheres come about if they are by necessity emanated by these intellects that are emanated from God? Challenge number 3, we may concede that perhaps each emanated intellect is that God emanates from himself. We have God is the prime intellect, and God emanates a second intellect, that second intellect emanates a third intellect, and so forth. But each intellectual entity is comprised of two different intellections. Every intellect that God emanates really is comprised of two parts of within that singular intellect. A, the cognition of itself, and B, the cognition of that which is other than itself. And that as a result, these two parts of the intellect spawn two emanations, a lower intellect, an intellect that is lower than itself. So intellect number 2 emanates intellect number 3. And because it has two parts of its intellection, of its intellectual makeup, one part of its intellect emanates an intellect lower than itself, and the other part of its intellect emanates a physical matter known as a sphere. And he's basically quoting Aristotelian science from Aristotle's works on how the cosmos work. But we would still ask, a sphere is a compound substance within itself, comprised of two kinds of matter and two kinds of form. A, the matter and form of the sphere itself, and B, the matter and form of the star embedded in the sphere. How does such a complex sphere, which contains a star, which is a different type of form and matter, emanate from a simple unitary intellection? Once again, contra proposition number 1, which says that that which is unitary begets or emanates that which is unitary. And finally, challenge number 4. Even if we come up with a way of explaining how this procession from the unitary agent comes about, we are still left with a quandary. Why is the matter of different stars so different? The substance of the bright stars may be a certain substance, and that of the dim ones may be another substance. So the question really is contra proposition number 4. We would expect that when something emanates, even if we can account for its compound nature, that it emanates from something which is unitary, we would expect there to be a minimization of its diversification. Right? We would expect to see the least amount of diversity from something that emanates from that which is unitary. Even if there is going to be diversity based on whatever explanation you're going to come up with, but we would expect to be more like the bone and less like the foot in the analogy that we gave in proposition number 4. And so why is it that we see so much diversity? Stars are completely different from each other. Spheres, the heavenly spheres, at least the way that Aristotle depicts them, are completely different based on their motion and based on their orbits and their velocities and so forth. We see that there's such disparate creation, such disparate entities that exist in the cosmos that seems to be contra proposition number 4, that even when you're dealing with compound structures, you would expect them to be conservative in their diversity. Now, to continue along for the rest of the chapter in this outline, we conclude from the above, to quote just directly from the text, that these things do not conform to the conception of necessity that Aristotle sets forth. It simply doesn't work. If everything is emanating by its nature, by necessity, because of what it is, then we would expect to see the universe looking different from what it is, and the heavens simply do not conform to the scientific propositions that we quoted above. And here are some additional challenges contained in this chapter. Number one, or A, the diversity of motion of the bodies also indicates that things did not occur by necessity, as discussed in chapter 19. And here, instead of talking about the nature of the stars themselves and their luminosity and their size, the Rambam talks about here, it's just a very similar challenge, but the motions are very, very different. Furthermore, if all the matter of the heavenly realm is unitary, why is there not uniformity among the spheres? Why is one particular form permanently in one particular matter, although the matter of all is common, unless someone asserts that the matter of every sphere is different from that of the others? That's a direct quote. Why is it that the celestial spheres are essentially different in their form? And I don't know how Aristotle knew that the form of each celestial sphere is different, unless what you call a form is the is the uh, is the ellipse of its orbit, the way that you trace its orbit or the way that it moves. Each sphere is transparent in using this Ptolemaic science of these concentric celestial spheres, as we've talked about all along in the Rambam. But why is it that some spheres are larger, some spheres are smaller? This indicates that the form of each one of the spheres is different, and that makes us conclude that the matter that they are imbued with must be different, because otherwise, if matter is uniform throughout the cosmos, we would expect the form that attaches to each material item to be the same, and that's simply not true. Furthermore, why is there not uniformity among the stars if they are all made of the same matter, which is very similar to challenge number 4 above? And if I perhaps were more steeped in Aristotelian logic, I might be able to explain the distinction between his previous question and this question, but it's still part of all of the same challenge. We must conclude, 4D, that the matter of each sphere and each star is unique, and thus each requires unique form. But if so, how is it that they do share a commonality in that the spheres all rotate in a circular motion and the stars all have the attribute of being fixed in their spheres? In other words, you're basically faced with two opposing principles. One is we see diversity within the cosmos, and witnessed by the fact that we see spheres, we see stars, we see different kinds of spheres and different kinds of stars. And yet, if we're going to conclude that the matter of each sphere and each star is different, is unique, then the question then becomes, what makes them share common features, such as all rotating in a circular motion, and all of the stars having this fixedness, or being embedded, allowing themselves to be embedded within their respective sphere. So with all of these questions in mind, the Rambam says that anytime you are going to suggest emanation by necessity or existence by necessity as a product of a higher agent, you are going to run into these problems. The only solution is to say that emanation comes as not as a result of necessity, but rather as a result of will. And therefore, this is where we're going to be reading the remainder of the chapter. And here we are on page 319, the second paragraph. If, however, we believe that all this has been produced through the purpose of one who purposed, made, and particularized it, as his wisdom, which cannot be grasped, required, none of these questions affect us, whereas they do affect him who claims that all this has come about through necessity and not through the will, the kavanah, of one who wills. This is an opinion, in other words, this opinion of Aristotle, that everything happens by necessity, that does not agree with the order of that which exists, an opinion in favor of which no cause and no persuasive proof have been brought forward. Everything that Aristotle says in this regard of emanation by necessity is either refuted or is not, at least not proven. Withal, very disgraceful conclusions would follow upon it. In other words, you're ending up with very, very distorted conclusions if you're going to stick to that position. Namely, it would follow that the deity, whom everyone who is intelligent recognizes to be perfect in every kind of perfection, could, as far as all the beings are concerned, produce nothing new in any of them. And this is an often quoted passage from Moreh Nevukhim, that the God of Aristotle, who emanates by necessity, is not capable of altering creation from what it is, because if everything emanates by necessity, then there can be no other possible existence other than the existence that we know. And that is limiting of God. That is not depictive of a perfect God, but rather a God who is limited by his inability to change that which necessarily emanates from him. If he wished to lengthen a fly's wing or to shorten a worm's foot, he would not be able to do it. But Aristotle will say, so what's Aristotle's response to this idea that he's limiting God by not allowing God to do anything other than that which necessarily emanates from him? He'll say that he would not wish it, and that it is impossible for him to will something different from what it is, that it would not add to his perfection, but would perhaps from a certain point of view be a deficiency. For Aristotle would argue that anytime you see a lack of perfection or a lack of necessity, you automatically see some kind of diminution of God's perfection. So we've talked a little bit about this before, because remember, some of the challenges to the whole idea of God volitionally bringing things into existence really calls into question what caused God to make it one way and not the other way, this question of particularization. And once you get into that question, it seems to point to the fact that God may be in some way deficient from one standpoint, in the sense that God simply wanted to make it a certain way and not another because of certain deficiencies within God before he emanates things in the way that he willed it. But the bottom line is, says the Rambam, I find Aristotle to be more limiting of God than enhancing God's perfection, based on the fact that the way that Aristotle depicts the prime cause, God is powerless to change the way things are. Even the most minute organism, God is incapable of changing very, very small changes. I shall sum up for your benefit, and though I know that many men imbued with a partisan spirit shall tax me because of this statement, either with having but little comprehension of their argument or with deliberately deviating from it, in other words, I know that I'm going to get detractors who are Aristotelian philosophers and will look at me as being provincial, small-minded, and really just not getting it. Yet shall I not, because of that, refrain from saying what I, in my inadequacy, have apprehended and understood. Accordingly, this summation is as follows. And the reason why the Rambam introduces his summation as follows is because what he's about to say is dramatically anti-Aristotelian, which is shocking and perhaps a bit daunting for the Rambam, because he is so much subscribed to the Aristotelian way of looking at the world. But he says as follows: everything that Aristotle has said about all that exists from beneath the sphere of the moon in the sublunary realm to the center of the earth is undoubtedly correct. And no one will deviate from it unless he does not understand it, or unless he has preconceived opinions that he wishes to defend or that lead him to a denial of a thing that is manifest. On the other hand, so before knocking Aristotle, he says Aristotle got everything 100% accurate in the sublunary realm where he resides, where man resides, because our observations of what's going on here work with the scientific calculations. Everything works perfectly the way Aristotle explains it. On the other hand, everything that Aristotle expounds with regard to the sphere of the moon and that which is above it, celestial realm, except for some certain things, something analogous is something analogous to guessing and conjecturing. Aristotle has not provided any proofs. Nothing can be gauged or tested to confirm his theories. All the more does this apply to what he says about the order of the intellects and to some of the opinions regarding the divine that he believes. For the latter contains grave incongruities and perversities that manifestly and clearly appear as such, not only to me, says the Rambam, but to everybody. He says, to all the nations. All the nations recognize that Aristotle has fallen short, that propagate, and here Pines translates it as evil, but it's not really evil, but rather errors, that propagate errors, and that he cannot demonstrate. And so the Rambam, quite reluctantly, it's taken him a long time to say very plain words. Aristotle got it wrong. That's a very hard admission for the Rambam to make, but he finally makes it in chapter 22 of the second section. Do not criticize me for having set out the doubts that attach to his opinion. You may say, can doubts that you, Maimonides, have disprove an opinion or establish that its contrary is true? Surely not. However, we shall treat this philosopher as his followers have told us to treat him, meaning we are only using the philosophical system of pursuing truth. For Alexander of Aphrodisias, who was a great follower of Aristotelian philosophy, has explained that in every case where no demonstration is possible, the two contrary opinions with regard to the matter in question should be posited as hypotheses, and it should be seen what doubts attach to each of them. You have two possible theories of how things became the way they are. You cannot prove either one. You should look at what questions exist for proposition A and what questions exist for proposition B that would seem to place them in doubt. The one to which fewer doubts attach should be believed. Alexander says that things are thus with respect to all the opinions regarding the divine that Aristotle sets forth and regarding which no demonstration is possible. For everyone who has come after Aristotle says that what Aristotle stated about them, meaning about matters regarding the divine, God and his celestial realm, arouses fewer doubts than whatever else might be said about them. In other words, granted, the followers of Aristotle subscribed to the Aristotelian depiction of God simply because they felt that even though they couldn't be proven, nevertheless, they had the fewest amount of questions attached to that depiction. We have acted in this way when it was to our mind established as true that, regarding the question whether the heavens are generated or eternal, neither of the two contrary opinions could be demonstrated. We cannot prove that the universe is eternal, nor can we prove that the universe is created. And we basically said, let us choose whichever one has the least amount of challenges. For we have explained the doubts attaching to each of the opinions and have shown to you that the opinion favoring the eternity of the world is the one that raises more doubts and is more harmful for the belief that ought to be held with regard to the deity. And therefore, the Rambam, purely on the basis of objective philosophy, says that Aristotle's theory of an eternal universe emanated by necessity by a first cause is flawed. It simply will not work. Now, up until now, the Rambam has been arguing based on philosophy. The very last lines of this chapter, the Rambam says that that's everything that I've talked about is based on logic, is based on my being a philosopher. I haven't even introduced the idea in this chapter that there is a second compelling reason to reject Aristotle's depiction of God and the eternality of the universe, which is, quite simply, we have a Masorah, we have a tradition, and we have a narrative contained in the Jewish Bible, which is completely contrary to Aristotle's depiction of an eternal universe. And that's not where he wants to go, because as a philosopher, the Rambam does not wish to rely on the authority of the Bible to be the final arbiter. He wishes rather to rely on the the sound intellectual arguments that defend the Torah's depiction of the way things are. And it is only afterwards, after he has demonstrated that intellectually the arguments work and the arguments are quite satisfying, that he then goes to the second reason why we should accept it, which is because it's our tradition. And therefore he says, and this in addition to the fact that the worlds being produced in time is the opinion of Avraham Avinu, Abraham our father, and our prophet Moses, may peace be on both of them. I find it fascinating that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi took a completely contrary um, uh, path in his work, the Kuzari, where he also came up with this conclusion that there is no way to prove either Aristotle's model of eternality or the Torah's model of creation at some point in time. And the Rebbe Yehuda Halevi's response to that was, since there is no way to prove either one intellectually, let's use our tradition, our Torah, as the final arbiter, because we have a tradition that is reliable and we can rely on it to tell us what truth is. The Rambam does not want to go in that direction. Rambam says that is not the way of the philosopher, and I will not sell out my intellect to relying on things based on purely based on authority. It has to be intellectually sound in order for us to be able to reach the highest level of our Judaism, which is to maximize the power of our intellect before we accept things on faith. So this is just a very, very important last part of this chapter. Is just very, very important for a number of reasons to really sort of dog tag this page and this chapter of Moreh Nevukhim. Now, last part, as we have mentioned, that opinions should be examined by means of the doubts they arouse. I see fit to explain to you something with regard to that. And chapter 23 will therefore be a very short chapter, basically speaking in generalities about whenever you can encounter questions or doubts, how you should deal with those doubts when you're dealing with speculative issues. And the Rambam's, this next chapter will sort of be a follow-up to the Rambam's whole methodology of arriving at truth when speculation and not absolute proof is the best that we're going to be able to get to. And so this is something that we'll approach next time, and this is where we will conclude. But I would like to finish by telling you that we will be taking a break for the next 2 Mondays because of my travels. And so we will see you, Bezrat Hashem, God willing, in 3 weeks from now. Okay, so we'll see you soon. Take care.